Being a kid is supposed to be fun and enjoyable, with days filled with playing and learning. But back in the late 1800s, especially if you were poor and lived near a coal mine, life of a child wasn't that easy. In fact, it was downright cruel. That's because coal mines employed young boys, mostly between the ages of 8 and 12, but sometimes as young as 5 or 6, to work in the mines as breaker boys. Their main job was to separate chunks of coal by hand. As coal came down the conveyor belt, they would break up the coal into common-sized pieces and also separate out any things like rocks, slate, sulfur, clay, and soil. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, and were paid very little. They worked very long hours without many breaks. They would sit on wooden seats, hunched over the chutes and conveyor belts. They would be hit by supervisors if they weren't working hard enough. The work performed by breaker boys was extremely dangerous. They were forced to work without gloves so they could better handle the slick coal. The slate was sharp, and the breaker boys would often leave work with their fingers cut and bleeding. They worked in constant close quarters with the rapidly moving conveyor belts, so they would oftentimes get caught in the belts and gears, causing them to lose fingers and sometimes limbs. Some even lost their lives being crushed to death in the machinery. There was always danger of getting caught and smothered by coal rushing down from the chutes. The coal would create a lot of dust, so asthma and lung disease were common. In a lot of the photos you see, the amount of soot on the children's faces gives you a good idea of what they were breathing in each day. Even if they survived working in the mines, a lot of them didn't live long lives due to the long-term health effects of working in these miserable conditions. By the age of 12, you were considered old enough to do adult jobs in the mine, but by then, most of them were already hunchbacked like old men. Being a breaker boy wasn't the only job children had in the coal mines. Some of the younger children worked as trappers, spending hour upon hour in almost complete darkness, opening and shutting ventilation covers and doors. They also pulled and pushed loaded carts through smaller tunnels that adults couldn't fit in. Cave-ins were always a threat in the mines. Gas poisoning and explosions were constant threats as well. Young children weren't the only ones used as breaker boys. Sometimes elderly workers who couldn't do other jobs would be paid very little to be breaker boys as well. In the late 1800s, there were over 20,000 breaker boys working in the Pennsylvania coal mines alone. Poorer families didn't have much choice in this era. If you were able to work, regardless of your age, you worked in order to contribute to the family in order to survive. Many of these children didn't receive an education and couldn't read and write well. Public criticism of the use of breaker boys and child labor in general started to grow. In 1885, Pennsylvania enacted a law forbidding the employment of anyone under the age of 12 from working as a coal breaker, but the law was poorly enforced, and many families would forge birth certificates so the children could support the family. In the early 1900s, photos from the mines, like those taken by Louis Hine, the photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, who would find ways into these mines and factories to take photos of the exploitation of these children. These photos increased public criticism and put pressure on the government for stronger child labor laws. The passage of stricter labor laws in both Britain and the U.S. helped end the use of breaker boys by 1920. By then, technology that helped wash the impurities off the coal already had reduced the need for breaker boys as well. These changes started allowing kids to be kids. So the next time your kids give you a hard time about taking out the trash, tell them the story about the breaker boys and how lucky they are not to be growing up 125 years ago. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.